My parents told me I needed to apologize. And the worst part was, they said it like I already knew what I'd done. They didn't explain it straight away. They just looked at me like I was avoiding it. Like I was pretending not to understand something that should have been obvious. At first, I thought it was a joke, because nothing had happened that day, and there was no reason for anything to feel off. I'd gone to work, come home, and everything felt completely normal, which is what made it feel so strange when they said it. There wasn't even a hint that something was wrong before that moment. No tension, no build-up, nothing to suggest anything had happened. My mom was the one who said it first, asking if I had something I wanted to say, and the way she said it made it clear she expected a specific answer. I told her no, because I genuinely didn't have anything to say, and I couldn't think of anything that would explain it. That's when she told me I needed to apologize, not suggested or asked, just said it like it had already been decided. I remember just standing there trying to figure out what I'd missed, because it didn't make sense for them to be that certain about something I didn't understand. So I asked her what she meant, and instead of explaining it, she just said I knew what I did, like repeating it would make it obvious. That tone people use when they think you're playing dumb made it worse, because I wasn't avoiding anything. I actually had no idea what she was talking about. Then my dad got involved, not aggressively, just backing it up like it was already understood, repeating it in a calmer way. But it didn't make anything clearer, it just made it feel more serious, like I'd missed something important. So I started going through everything in my head, every conversation, every interaction, trying to work out what this could be about. And one thing came to mind from a few days earlier, something small that didn't seem important at the time. I'd been at a small get-together with a few people, nothing big, just a casual night with maybe 6 or 7 people. The whole night felt normal, just conversations, drinks, nothing that stood out as a problem. At one point, the conversation shifted onto work, and someone started talking about how their manager handled something badly. It turned into one of those group discussions where everyone adds their opinion, nothing serious, just normal conversation. I remember making a comment about how situations can sound worse than they actually are when you only hear one side of them. It wasn't aimed at anyone directly, just a general point based on what we were talking about. One person reacted slightly differently though, not openly upset, but a bit defensive, like they thought I was referring to them. I noticed it at the time, so I clarified what I meant straight away to avoid any misunderstanding. After that, the conversation moved on, and nothing else came from it, which is why I didn't think about it again. There was no argument, no tension, nothing that felt unresolved, and everyone carried on like normal. At least, that's how I remembered it. But there was one small moment right after that, which didn't stand out at the time. Someone laughed, but it didn't feel like a normal reaction to what was said, more like they were trying to move things along quickly. At the time, I didn't question it, because it didn't seem important enough to think about. Now it felt different. There was also a moment later in the night where 2 people were talking quietly off to the side, just briefly. It wasn't obvious or dramatic, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. Again, at the time it didn't seem important, but now it felt connected. After I left that night, everything felt completely normal, which is what made the whole situation harder to process later. There were no messages, no awkward follow-ups, nothing to suggest anything had gone wrong. That's what made it feel disconnected from reality. Because if something actually happens, you usually feel it in the moment. There's tension or silence, or something that tells you it didn't land right. But there was none of that. So hearing it come back like this didn't make sense. It felt like a version of events that had been built somewhere else. So, I asked my parents if that was what this was about, because it was the only thing that even slightly made sense. They looked at each other for a second before answering. And that was the first moment something didn't feel right. Because if that was the issue, they would have just said yes without hesitation. Instead, my mom said it was part of it, which didn't explain anything and only made it more confusing. So I asked who told them. Because at that point it was clear this hadn't come directly from me. There was a pause after that, longer this time, and it was obvious they didn't want to answer straight away. And that was when I knew something wasn't right. Because if I'd actually done something wrong, there wouldn't be hesitation. They would have just said it. But instead, my mom eventually gave a name, and the second I heard it, everything shifted. Because it was someone who had been there that night, but not someone I'd had any issue with. In fact, I barely spoke to them properly throughout the evening, which made it even harder to understand. So now I wasn't just confused anymore. I was trying to work out how they were even involved in this. I asked what they had been told, and at first they kept it vague, like they didn't want to repeat it directly. But at that point, I needed to hear it clearly, because none of it was making sense. So I pushed a little, just enough to make it clear I wasn't going to leave it unanswered. And when they finally said it didn't sound like the same situation at all. They said I'd been rude, that I'd made a comment that upset people, and that I'd left in a way that made it obvious I didn't care. But that wasn't what happened. Not even close. What actually happened was a short conversation that got slightly awkward for a moment, and then moved on without any issue. No one reacted the way they were describing, and I didn't leave in any way that stood out. So hearing it described like that didn't just feel wrong. It felt like a completely different version of events. I asked them exactly what they'd been told I said, because I needed to understand how it had changed. And when they repeated it, I could immediately see what had happened. A small part of what I said had been taken out of context. Everything around it had been filled in with assumptions. What was originally just a passing comment had been turned into something intentional. And the more I listened, the more obvious it became that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a rewritten version of the story. I explained what actually happened, not defensively, just clearly, going through the conversation step by step. I told them what was said, what I meant by it, and how it was responded to at the time. I explained that it didn't turn into anything serious, and that no one reacted the way they were describing. At first, they didn't say much, they just listened, and let me explain it fully. But I could see it on their faces that something wasn't lining up anymore. They were trying to match what I was saying with what they'd been told, and it wasn't working. So I went into more detail, explaining exactly where the comment came from, and why it might have sounded different if someone only heard part of it. I pointed out that the person who told them wasn't even part of that part of the conversation. That mattered, because it meant they didn't actually hear it properly. That was the moment everything started to shift, because now it wasn't just my version against theirs. It was about what actually made sense. My dad asked a question about something specific, trying to confirm one detail. And when I answered it, it directly contradicted what they'd been told. That's when the confidence they had at the start started to fade. They didn't say it out loud, but you could feel it. The certainty was gone. And now it was just unclear. I could see my mom thinking through it properly for the first time, going back over what she'd heard and realizing how much of it didn't actually add up. My dad was quieter, but you could tell he was doing the same thing. And for the first time since the conversation started, it didn't feel like I was the one being judged. It felt balanced again. That's when I said it because it felt like the right moment to make it clear. I told them I wasn't going to apologize for something I didn't do. I said it calmly, not aggressively, just clearly enough that there was no room for misunderstanding. There was a pause after that, but it felt completely different to before. Because this time, no one argued, no one pushed back, and no one told me I was wrong. And that silence said everything. The conversation didn't end dramatically. It just stopped, like there was nothing left to say. That something had changed in that moment, even if it wasn't said out loud. Not just in how they saw the situation, but in how I handled it. Because before that, I probably would have just gone along with it. Even if it didn't make sense. Even if I didn't agree. I would have just apologized to keep things calm. But this time, I didn't. And that changed something. Later that day, I messaged the person who had supposedly said all of this, because I wanted to understand their side of it. I didn't accuse them. I just asked if there had been some kind of misunderstanding. The response was vague, not a denial, but not a clear explanation either. That made it worse, because now it felt like even they weren't sure what had actually happened. I asked them directly what they told my parents because I needed clarity, and the way they explained it was different again, not as extreme, but still more accurate. It was like the story had changed each time it was repeated, each version adding something new, and moving further away from what actually happened. That's when it really clicked. This wasn't just one person saying something. It was a chain. One comment, slightly misunderstood, then repeated, then changed again until it became something that sounded real. If I hadn't been there myself, I probably would have believed it too, because it wasn't completely made up. It was just altered in a way that made it sound convincing. A few days later, I spoke to someone else who had been there that night, just casually bringing it up, and their version was exactly how I remembered it. Normal. No issue. Nothing worth talking about. That confirmed it. The problem wasn't what happened. It was how it had been retold. And that part stayed with me more than anything else. Not just because of that situation, but because of how easily it could happen again. Because once something like that starts, it doesn't need much to grow. Just a small misunderstanding and a small assumption, And it builds. Even after everything was cleared up, there was still a part of it that stayed with me longer than I expected. Not in an obvious way, but in how I started noticing things differently after that. Little things like how quick people form opinions based on partial information, or how easily something can sound convincing when it's repeated with confidence. It made me realize how often people don't actually question where something came from. They just accept it if it sounds believable enough. And that applies to way more situations than just this one. Because thinking back, I could remember other moments where something felt slightly off, but I didn't really stop to question it. Times where someone said something about someone else, and I just took it at face value. Not because I fully believed it, but because there was no reason not to. And that's the part that changed. Now, I notice it. Not in a paranoid way, just in a more aware way. There was actually another moment not long after that made it even clearer. I was in a completely different setting, different group of people, and someone brought up a situation about someone who wasn't there. They explained it in a way that made it sound pretty straightforward. But something about it felt slightly off, not enough to call it out, just enough to notice. And before, I probably wouldn't have thought about it twice. But this time I did, because I realized I was hearing one version of something again. Not the full situation, just a version of it. And I started thinking about how easily that could turn into something else if it kept getting repeated. How it could shift slightly each time, without anyone meaning for it to. And how quickly that could become the truth. That's when it really clicked for me. Not just what happened that night, but how normal it actually is. It's not always intentional. Most of the time, it isn't. It's just how people process things, fill in gaps, and pass information on. But that doesn't make it accurate. And it definitely doesn't mean you should just accept it without thinking. That whole situation changed something small but important for me. Not in a dramatic way, just in how I respond to things like that now. I don't immediately assume I've done something wrong just because someone says I have. And I don't immediately accept someone else's version of events without thinking about it properly. Because I've seen how easily things can shift, and how quickly something small can turn into something completely different. And that's when it really settled in. Not just what happened, but how close I came to just accepting it. Because if I hadn't questioned it, even slightly, that version of the story would have become the truth. And once that happens, it's hard to undo. Because the part people don't really think about is how often things like that happen, without anyone ever correcting it. Situations where no one questions it, no one pushes back, and it just stays that way. And once it stays that way long enough, it stops feeling like a version of events and just becomes what everyone believes. Which is probably the most unsettling part of all. Because it means sometimes the only thing separating the truth from something completely different is whether someone decides to speak up. Be honest. Would you have questioned it? Or just said sorry to keep the peace? And if you like stories like this, where one small moment completely changes everything, make sure you stick around.